I don't think there was any particular person at McGill who encouraged me or inspired me to think of going on. Indeed, I think at McGill I was really having entered at 16 and left when I was 19 or 20. I was a child still and in many ways extremely immature. And I had no particular desire to go on at that time and had no thought of going on to postgraduate studies. It was only in the course of time after I left McGill, which was in 1952, through the 50s that I began to become interested in, as I say, the world outside of Montreal, of Canada, and at that time there was a great deal going on. A lot of the countries who had ex-colonial countries were becoming independent, and I, among others, of course, grew much more interested in finding out what was going on and in learning more about what we now call the Third World. I began to read about some of the issues that were taking place at the time, and when I finally decided that I wanted to continue my studies, I had to think obviously of where to do them, where I wanted to do my postgraduate work. It was, I think, quite impossible in Canada at that time, since none of the universities really had a proper program of Third World Studies. There were some in the United States, but it was terribly expensive and I couldn't afford it. I think I also was ready to leave Canada at that time, ready to leave what was a very constrained society. Quebec hadn't opened up. It was still a very conservative, extremely conservative society, the most conservative probably in North America. And I felt I wanted to get away from that for a time. And Britain, being an ex-colonial country, of course, had a great deal of programs which did enable me to pursue these postgraduate studies. I looked around. There was no internet, so I couldn't search the internet, but I did something similar by writing around to different universities to find out if there was any program that might have been interesting. And lo and behold, I got a letter back from SOAS, signed by Furer-Haimendorf, Professor Christoph von Furer-Haimendorf, who was very encouraging and very welcoming, and also informed me that the fees were only £50 a year, which I thought was fantastic, because that was the kind of, I think, the kind of financial commitment that I was able to make. And that basically is how I came to SOAS. I didn't come specifically to do anthropology, although I was thinking of it. And interestingly enough, I went around to the bookshops in Montreal to find out what anthropology was really all about, and bought something edited by Ottenberg, which I still have, by the Ottenbergs, I should say, Cultures and Societies of Africa. And one of the articles that was reproduced in it was Meyer Fortis's Unilineal Descent Group article. And after reading that, I nearly decided to stay home, actually, after that. But I persevered. I came to SOAS, and after talking to Christoph Haimendorf again, decided that really I'd better focus on anthropology, and that is basically how I started my career in anthropology at SOAS.
Excellent. Well, since Christoph von Furer-Haimendorf was my supervisor, has come up several times in the conversation and made it later, it's nice from time to time to have little memories or vignettes of him, and you knew him better than almost anyone over the years for a very long time. Is there anything that you would, as they say in the religious world, like to share with us about Christoph?
Well, Interestingly, he was, of course, the head of the department when I came in 1961, in the autumn of 1961. But I had very little to do with him the first year because I had to do, having had no background in anthropology, I had to do a qualifying year, which meant basically going around to undergraduate courses at all levels, both at the LSE and at SOAS. I was taught by, I attended lectures by Shapira and Firth and Friedman at the LSE, and I went to classes at SOAS with Adrian Mayer and George Huntingford and Fred Bailey. At the end of the first year, I was still very much, I should say, I was still very much thinking of Africa. I mean, at that time, anthropology was basically African anthropology, and there were very little, although SOAS itself, of course, had people who were working in South Asia, and Christoph Haimendorf himself was a South Asianist. But the undergraduate work that I was doing, the qualifying year, was basically focused on Africa. And so I assumed almost naturally that I would, if I ever went on, I would focus on Africa. I, in fact, wrote an MA thesis the second year on African land tenure. But at the end of that year, when I was deciding to go on, or had decided to go on to a PhD, the pressure, in a sense, encouragement, put it that way, began from Freddie Bailey and Adrian Mayer and Christoph himself to think of going to South Asia. And as it happened, there was money for South Asia, but not for Africa, which in a way was very fortuitous. I thought initially of doing my research in Sikkim. This was something that Christoph himself said was an interesting place to work in, because there was the Drukpa Tibetan based minority rulers, and of course a majority Nepalese immigrant population. So it would have been a very interesting, I think, research area. But the Indian government at the time had just, I think they just fought a war with China, and they weren't really interested in anthropologists traipsing around Sikkim. So Christoph then said, well, why don't you go to Nepal? And of course he had just a few years previously opened the gates, as it were, and I decided, well, why not? So I think serendipity is really the key word, or the key theme here in my career so far. I mean, it was serendipitous that I came to SOAS. It was serendipitous that I ended up working in Nepal, but that's what I did.
So coming back again, that you may not want to talk about Christoph now, but the account you've given is exactly the same as mine, which is that I met Christoph and he said, what about Nepal? And I went to Nepal because I couldn't go somewhere else. But he certainly influenced me in all sorts of indirect ways, but I was never a colleague of his, and I never ran a department with him. And I knew him better later in his life than earlier in many ways. Some people are critical of him as just an ethnographer. Other people say that there was an anthropologist there, and that he combined these things. How would you assess him, either as in any way you like, as a human being, as a head of department, or as an anthropologist?
Well, as a head of department, I thought he was extraordinary. He was very much able to control the department, to organize it, to do all the things that a head of department needed to do, although they weren't perhaps as onerous then as they are now. He was extremely well connected right to the top of the school, so he had enormous, because he was a senior professor and very much respected, had enormous influence in the school, and if there were things that the department wanted or needed, or colleagues of his wanted or needed, he was usually able to negotiate, to put in a good word. Christoph had the knack of having his finger in many pies, and I don't say that with any sense of criticism. He really did have a way of keeping his eyes and ears very much open and doing the best for his staff and his students. As a supervisor, I think he was very good. He was my supervisor. When I went to Nepal, of course, it was obvious he would be the one. He was always encouraging. He read everything. He wasn't the kind of supervisor who would expect you to write things and never read them. He read and he commented always, sensibly, always with insight. He himself, as an anthropologist, I think he was a good ethnographer. He had an incredible knowledge of Nepal, of all aspects of Nepal. I mean, he suggested, for example, that I try thinking about, that I should think about East Nepal, because he said he knew that there were some groups there that had particular kind of so-called communal land or kipot land, and that this might be a very interesting kind of research. So he had the feel for what could make interesting research, and he was invaluable in that. I mean, I don't see how I could have possibly come or gone to where I went and done what I did without Christoph, in a sense, suggesting that this was a real possibility.
People who say that he was an ethnographer but not really an anthropologist. I was wondering your views about it.
I think that's a very unfair and probably untrue. Christoph, in presenting his ethnographies, and of course he had very many ethnographies, would very often make or come to tentative conclusions about his findings. He would, but very often they were, I say tentative because he was often very willing to revise them. And if people criticized what he had concluded, then he would be able always to revise his thinking, revise his conclusions himself. And I think this is an incredible virtue. When you think back, how many high theories that were propagated in the 60s and 70s are current today? I mean, anthropology doesn't, the theory is constantly changing. The theory is constantly being revised, is constantly being critiqued. And this is as it should be, of course, but I don't think Christoph's theories are any less valid in that sense than were those of other so-called bigger and better theoretical anthropologists. Their theories today are, on the whole, not terribly current, and we don't disrespect them or lose respect for them because of it. So I think Christoph was able to constantly rethink, represent his work in a way that made it constantly stimulating. And I don't think he is any less an anthropologist than so many others who were there with him, alongside him.
Thank you. So can we now move back to Nepal? You went out to do your field work among the Limbus. It's nice often to have something on the sort of first reactions of when you arrived in somewhere like Nepal, and then it was quite early in the opening up of Nepal. Do you remember those first days, months?
Yes, I do, very clearly, actually. I arrived in Kathmandu in early 1964, and I was hosted by Professor Dor Bahadur Bista, who had been a friend in SOAS, who had taught me or tried to teach me Nepali, and whose own interest in Nepal was very stimulating. When I look back, I think that Dor Bahadur Bista was a great teacher in so many ways. Anyway, I lived for a few weeks with him in his house. He was very generous and helped me to organize, as only Dor Bahadur in those days could, helped me to organize my visas and my permits and my travel. And I left after several weeks with all the necessary papers to go to East Nepal. In those days, there were flights to Biratnagar in the east, and Christoph had arranged for me to be met in Biratnagar by some people at the Gurkha camp, which was only a few miles away at Dharan. And I was taken to Dharan with all my luggage, which was incredibly large, 7 or 8 or 10 pieces of huge, great luggage, amounts of luggage. And at the camp I was put up for a few days, and they arranged for me then to take porters and go off, and I had to walk 7 days, which was, for somebody who hadn't really ever walked anywhere before, this was quite an ordeal. I made it to Ilam, and there I proceeded, as so many anthropologists do, to explore the region and to ask about where I might settle. I knew that I wanted to be in a village or a settlement where there were Limbus, and I'd assumed, I think, that I would do a study of the Limbus, and that was it was the kind of study that was expected in so many quarters. In the work that had been done to date, of course, Haimendorf had done a study of the Sherpas, and Bernard Pigned of the Gurungs, and John Hitchcock of the Muggars. So I assumed that my assignment, as it were, was the Limbus. And so I wanted to be obviously in an area where there were Limbus. And finally I did, after a few weeks, I managed to find a convenient settlement and people who would accept me and who would make me welcome, which they did. And that's how I kind of arrived in my field.
Could you very briefly outline the main theme of your fieldwork, because it's been very influential. I remember reading your book very closely, and it helped me a great deal in my fieldwork. But it obviously seems to have been linked, which I hadn't realised, with your MA thesis on land tenure in Africa, because it was around land tenure, was it not?
Yeah.
So the main thrust of it was, and conclusions were...
Right. Well, I, as I say, I did go out thinking that I would do a study of the Limbus, and alerted by Christoph, I was expecting to find a system of land tenure which was perhaps a little unusual in Nepal. It was called Kipat, and it was sometimes referred to as communal tenure. Something which is probably quite common in many parts of the tribal world, and certainly in South Asia. And I set about asking questions about this and observing and doing all the things that anthropologists do with a view to writing about their land tenure system. But as so often happens in anthropology, what you set out to do and what you end up doing sometimes differ quite considerably. And it became quite obvious to me in the course of the fieldwork that a major factor was the encounter between the Limbus and the non-Limbus, the high castes in particular, who had entered the territory of the Limbus over many years and by various means had come to dominate the land and of course did dominate the government already. So it became more than simply a study of how land is important to the Limbus. It became in a sense a study of an encounter between two people and over land and how this worked itself out politically, economically, and in a variety of other ways. I still hadn't quite decided on how, or decided, I suppose is the word. I hadn't quite realized all the implications of my field work until quite a bit later when I returned and started to write, because my thesis, my examiner, my external examiner, told me that my thesis was very boring. It was very good, but very boring. Because I'm not sure I'm able to reveal that. I think they were very, very fair, but it was a study, a very dry study of land tenure among the Limbus, and obviously the high castes were mentioned, but the full kind of potential of what I, in a sense, had emerged with wasn't realized until the same examiner said, but you really are talking about this confrontation, this encounter between two people. And I think when I wrote the book, this was then the main focus of the book, the way in which these two groups had struggled over this particular kind of land, and of course all the implications of its alienation over many years.
Can I ask you just a tiny bit about the Limbus as a people, because as you mentioned, you're dealing with the confrontation between an Indo-Aryan group, high caste groups, and the Tibeto-Burman Limbu people. Were you surprised or interested or struck by about Limbu character and so on?
Yes, well, I mean, it was the contrast, I think, between the mainly high castes in the area and Ilam. I should say that the Ilam district was an area which was very mixed, and probably the majority of people were not Limbus. So, I mean, the Limbus were not completely dominant there. But it was very, the contrasts were very interesting. So, whereas when I was a young man, and when I passed young Brahmin women, of course, the covers would come out, their shawls would be put across the front of their face. There was no dialogue, of course, there couldn't be. Yet young Limbu women would come and chat and smoke cigarettes and do all the things that a Brahmin woman would never do in my house most evenings. This was their entertainment. I was their unusual guest, and they had no inhibitions about talking and about joking and with me. And in fact, one of my assistants was a young Brahmin fellow, and he could not believe the way that these young Limbu women would behave, as it were, with people of the opposite sex, and that was one of the first things that struck me. I think just generally the Limbus were more open. They would dance their famous dhanach, their rice dances were going on every evening. So if there were a guest in the area, they would immediately organize a dance for them. Their weddings were much more lively affairs, and so on. So I mean, one saw it all the time around one, and it couldn't fail to make an impression. And it's hard when you are a newcomer to an area not to be much more, as it were, attracted to the Limbus than perhaps to the much more inhibited high castes. But that also changes over time, and one realizes that each has its own very different ways of behaving to the anthropologist and to each other.
I found my fieldwork in a similar situation very stressful, and I was quite unhappy for long periods for various reasons. Would you say that you enjoyed the fieldwork, or that when you left you were quite relieved to be ending it? How was your feeling about doing the fieldwork there?
I found it incredibly hard. I mean, I'm not usually a very compulsive person, but I felt completely compulsive when I was in the field. I felt that if I wasn't doing something all the time, I was missing something, or I wasn't really living up to the expectations of my grant givers or my supervisors and so on. So I did work very hard, and this is in itself stressful. But I felt I had to leave on several occasions, and I needed to leave for breaks, and I did that. Fortunately, I was able to get up to Darjeeling, which Ilam is very close to, for a break, and traveled a little bit in India, then came back refreshed and went on. I think I enjoyed it. On the whole, obviously there were times when I was totally frustrated, as one gets. People who promise to help you don't help you, papers that you've been waiting for don't show up, bureaucrats make promises which they don't keep, and so on and so on. But on the whole, I think it was an enjoyable and memorable experience, and I don't remember it, even in retrospect, not enjoying the field work.
Thank you. When you came back to write up your PhD, it must have been, by this time, what date was this? This was
April of 1965 I came back.
Yes. When I knew you, you already had a lectureship, I think, at SOAS. So was this quite soon into your PhD, or after the PhD?
It was actually before I left the field. I was sent a letter which got lost in the post, but I was told later on. You'll remember that the mid-60s were a time of incredible expansion in the universities. A lot of new universities were built, Sussex and I think Kent, and a whole variety of others. And so anthropologists were moving from one place to another, and Freddie Bailey left to go to Sussex, of course. And I think they were needing somebody to fill a junior lectureship, and Christoph sent me a letter, and as I say, it got lost in the post, but I eventually heard about it, and of course I was delighted and accepted. So when I came back in March, I had an interview with the director and Christoph, and it was agreed that I would take the lectureship, and that's how things were done in those days. And Christoph, as always, had organized it. So I'm afraid I didn't enter a competition. I didn't have to compete against other candidates. and I started teaching in the autumn of 1965 while I was still writing my thesis. And I finished it in, I think it was the end of '66, and was examined. And the PhD was awarded. So I was actually already teaching while I was writing the thesis. I don't think that happens very often today.
Did you enjoy teaching?
At the beginning I did. It was very challenging. Obviously, it's very stressful. You have to keep abreast of the literature. You have to read things that you perhaps wouldn't normally want to read or have to read. So you're constantly challenged, but it is, I would think, the best way to know what's going on and to know who's writing what and what the latest ideas are. So I think teaching is very stimulating, and for that as well as other reasons. I think towards the end of my career, after 30 years or 25 or 30 years of teaching sometimes subjects for a number of years, it does begin to pall a little bit. But so I wouldn't say it's the most glamorous part or most interesting part of a career towards the end, but it is very stimulating at the beginning. And of course, from time to time, you were asked to do new courses, or you offered to do new courses, and you're again challenged. You're again forced to read again and to rethink things and to organize your thoughts in a very precise way. It's good.
After 2 or 3 years, you then went out, because I met you in 1969 at the Thyssen Center in Kathmandu, as I remember, and you already seemed a very senior figure, and I was much in awe of you. What was this second field work about? Right.
Well, the second field work was a study of a district capital, a district center. In Nepal, there were a number of these around the country, of course. They were capitals of districts, by this time 75 districts in Nepal. They were where the administration was located. They were where the main schools would be, and so on. So I thought it would be, after my rural study, I thought it might be interesting to do a study of an administrative center of this kind, of a district capital. And since I'd been in the East, I decided perhaps it might be an interesting change to go to West Nepal. So I decided on a district called Dailek, which was in far western Nepal, and in 1969 went out to do a study there. And it turned out to be an interesting study, because there was virtually nothing about such district capitals written, and it involved studying bureaucrats, many of whom, of course, were from outside the area, their relationships, and the sort of government officials and government representatives, and the way in which they interacted with local populations. It was, of course, because it was the commercial center, it enabled me to look at the way in which commerce operated, the way in which local people, many of whom were the businessmen who came into the bazaar, and so on. And so it was a very new experience, and one that I really had no inkling of, no preparation for in my work to date. So it was a revelation. I must say, though, that I didn't enjoy that fieldwork as much as I had the previous one, partly because I think the first, well, in my case, the first was my first love, as it were, was very special. Partly because there were no people like the Limbus in the West and I found them much more reserved. Also, I got ill about halfway through. In fact, I was just reading Pepys's diary, and he had a kidney stone just like I did, or I had a kidney stone just like he did. And of course, that rather spoiled things a bit. But I found it stimulating and interesting for what it was, and ended up writing a book called Administration and Politics, which in a Nepalese district capital, I think it was called, and was focused very much on the interface, the ways in which bizarre people in the district capital related to the surrounding rural areas, as well as within the bazaar itself, the various kinds of dynamic that took place.
When you then came back over the next 30 years or so, 25 years, you were teaching at SOAS. You were contemporary with a number of very distinguished and interesting people. You mentioned Freddie Bailey had gone away, but I'm not sure whether you overlapped with John Middleton, but certainly Abner Cohen and Adrian Mayer and others. Are there any of these who it would be nice to just give a little pen portrait of? Particularly Adrian, who I knew well, but Abner maybe.
Well, Adrian, of course, had been at SOAS a few years when I came as a student, and he was very encouraging. He was one of my teachers, and I always found his comments, his suggestions very helpful. He was, I admired particularly his work on caste and kinship. I thought it, perhaps it might even today be still the best study of caste and kinship in India. It was meticulous, it was extremely detailed and extremely careful, and that was in many ways an inspiration. I mean, Adrian certainly was a good example to follow in terms of how to present and write and present ethnology. He was very fair. He was always very fair to everyone. He would never choose favorites. He would never, when he became, I'm talking now when he became head of department after Christoph retired, he was always very fair to everybody and went to bat for everybody equally. He was a very good administrator, probably even more efficient than Christoph had been. He was an extremely good administrator and a very good supervisor of theses. He didn't supervise mine, but I knew many students who spoke very highly of him as a supervisor. He was extremely meticulous, extremely careful, always efficient in reading and commenting on. In fact, they would very often get it back almost as they finished handing it in. I mean, it was almost too much for some, but he was very highly thought of, and I don't think Adrian ever put a foot wrong. He was a very good anthropologist, a very good administrator, a very good head of department, and a wonderful supervisor. I have nothing but admiration for him.
Thank you very much. And perhaps just one other, Abner Cohen, who unfortunately I never had a chance to interview. We nearly did, and then he became ill at the end. That he is still much respected by our students, I know, who read his books, and a very thoughtful man.
Abner, of course, came to SOAS from Manchester and had, as it were, grown up in Manchester. And he was always very theoretically sophisticated. And he was always very challenging as well. He was in seminars. Avner would be quiet until near the end of the seminar, and then he would emerge with a comment that could be either devastating or absolutely to the point. His work was very stimulating, and everybody in that department was, in one way or another, I think, beholden to Avner for some comments, some thoughts. And in my own case, I was just writing my first book when Avner's work on West Africa, on urban West Africa, was published. And when I read bits of it, a number of things, problems which I was struggling with, fell into place, and I feel feel that I owe him, and always did feel that I owed him a great deal. Avner's ability to see through an argument into an argument, and to propose a criticism, very often a positive, helpful criticism, was absolutely unmatched. He was a very big influence in that department for many years.
Thank you. Are those were local giants, so to speak, Avner and Adrian, were there other either anthropologists or non-anthropologists, sociologists, theoreticians, either in Britain, America, France, or elsewhere, who really have had a deep influence on your work?
Well, I think when I was starting, I was influenced to a larger extent, I think, by the Manchester School than perhaps by any other. Gluckman's work, and I remember William Watson work on the Momway, and Bill Epstein's on the Copper Belt struck me then as a kind of new genre, which was very different, very exciting, very contemporary, and was not simply a kind of classical ethnography of a particular people, but rather a much more dynamic or attempt to bring a dynamism to their work that I don't think was very evident at the time in the sort of major figures, and I think that that was very stimulating. Then I suppose people like Peter Worsley were always very interesting.
Which part of Peter Worsley? Is it his Third World bit, or the
I think his Third World, and the trumpet, of course, shall sound. Is it the trumpet shall sound? I've forgotten it now. When I was working on, began to work on Christians in Madras, I did read some of the literature which was relevant, or at least I thought was relevant. So Christopher Hill, Keith Thomas, and of course E.P. Thompson were influential as far as I was concerned at that time. I mean, I hadn't really encountered their work or thought their work all that relevant when I was working in East Nepal, but they certainly influenced some of my thinking when I came to do the work on Christians.
So Lionel, you'd worked in Nepal up till this point in time. You worked on economics and politics mainly. How is it that you shifted from that to another part of the continent and another part of human endeavour, religion?
Well, I had studied a rural area, worked in a rural area, and then a small town, and I was beginning to think that perhaps the next step would be work in a city. By this time, Pat, who I had married a few years earlier, and I had two small children when I was ready to go back to the field, And because I'd been ill in West Nepal, we agreed that it probably wasn't a good idea to bring small children to a remote part of Nepal. And so I decided to go to work in India. It happens that on our way back from West Nepal, we stopped in Madras. We'd been in the north, we hadn't been in the south. And while walking around, I noticed that there were quite considerable numbers of churches. And I thought it might be interesting to do a study of Indian Christianity. There had been, as far as I knew at the time, no studies by anthropologists of the Indian Christian community in India. And maybe because coming from a Jewish background, it sounded like a challenge. So that's how I came to Madras, and at the time Pat was also working on women's organizations in the same city, so we were able to combine two projects.
Thank you. You mentioned Pat Caplan, who is also a distinguished anthropologist. Quite a lot of anthropologists work with their spouses. It's obviously very convenient, but it also leads to quite a lot of difficulties in some cases. I was wondering if you had anything to say about, not directly about Pat, who we're talking to shortly, but about the advantages and disadvantages of being married to another anthropologist.
I honestly can't think of any disadvantages, maybe from personal experience. I just don't know what the disadvantages might be. The advantages are that you are able, as it were, to communicate perhaps at a level that you might not always be able to communicate with someone who is not an anthropologist and therefore who doesn't share the sort of background. But this can be a very stimulating process, because you're constantly interacting, you're communicating about the different work that you're doing, and as it were, helping each other. We've never had any problems as far as I know. I should say that we've never worked on the same project. I think that might be a different kettle of fish. We've worked on 2 or 3 occasions together, at least in the same area, but we haven't actually worked on the same project. And that, I think, probably helps the distance, to keep the distance.
Thank you. Another interest which you developed later led to a book on the representation of the Gurkhas by British Army officers. I wondered how you got interested in that, fairly briefly.
Well, I had, of course, met many ex-Gurkhas, people who had been in the Gurkhas while I was in East Nepal. And it always intrigued me to know more about their lives as Gurkhas. And so when I was preparing my book or writing my book, I did some reading on Gurkhas and most of these writings were by ex-British officers. In the course of time, during the 80s, there had been a lot of thinking and writing in anthropology about how we represent other people, how we represent the other, as it were. And when I read some of this, I thought, well, it might be interesting to look at the way someone else, not anthropologists only, but British officers, represented their Gurkhas. And this ultimately ended up in a book which I published in 1995 on which was called Warrior Gentlemen, on the way in which British officers or ex-British officers represented their Gurkhas through time.
Thank you. Well, we've covered only, as one can, only fragments of a rich and interesting life. Were there any other things which you would hoped I might ask you, or anything else that you wanted to lay down in digital form, so to speak, for the future?
Well, I just one other project, which was my last project before I retired, which was a study of Anglo-Indians, the most sort of marginal people, and who had been very much buffeted by the British colonial powers for many years, and of course now are getting its some of this treatment from the Indian authorities. And so it was very interesting, since I had met them in the course of my work on Christians, to examine a sort of history of the community, and to see how they have coped with their very anomalous position. And so, of course, it enabled me to write about some of the issues of hybridity and multiculturalism and so on, which were current in anthropology at the time. I think I would find it very difficult to find a common thread in all my work, but if there is such a thread, I'd like to think it was an attempt to give voice to the perhaps the disaffected, the marginalized members of society, and to examine how this position is expressed or challenged culturally.
Obviously someone will take that up and wonder whether this has any relation to how we started, which was a young Jewish boy in Canada, but we'll leave it to your biographers to do that. Thank you very much indeed, Lionel, for the fascinating account. Thanks
Thank you.
very much.
Thank you.